I want to suggest a way of coping with avoidant personality disorder that I kind of realize it's what I do in sort of a macro level, and the people who seem to be successful at sort of living with avoidant personality disorder. I'm definitely not saying that this is going to be you out living your best life. But it works. Okay. It's a two-pronged approach. And that's kind of common in therapy to do something like that, to have, instead of doing one thing at a time, you do two. And the most obvious is dialectical behavioral therapy, which was a therapy developed for people with borderline personality disorder. And it's very helpful for people with borderline personality disorder. And I think it's actually a good sort of training therapy overview for just anybody. But it is really difficult for somebody with avoidant personality disorder to go through it, because those two tenets are accept your life exactly as it is. Well, a lot of people with avoidant personality disorder, especially their own perception of what's going on in their life and how their life is going and the effect they have on people, etc., isn't really in touch with reality. I heard somebody say once that it was just shy of a delusion how closely people with avoidant personality disorder hold on to the idea that they're terrible, in the face of facts and data that suggest otherwise. So to go into that with such bad self-esteem and assuming that everything you do is your fault and it's, you're to blame for everything and you're just awful and so much less worthy and of everybody else on the planet, etc. That's really hard to say, I'm going to go in and accept my truth of my life. That's impossible. Not impossible, but it is torture. And then the second part of dialectical behavioral therapy is then change what you can change. Well, the stuff that needs to be changed for avoidant personality disorder, if you have your personality set, you can't change it. It's permanent, the really bad stuff. So, everything you'd want to change, you can't. So it knocks you down and then kicks you when you're down, basically, if you're doing DBT and you have avoidant personality disorder. A cat crawling around. Anyway, the dual approach that I live my life as, and again, people I've seen who are more successful at coping with avoidant personality disorder, is this. And it's even more basic and similar, but more basic. Which is, one, accept it. It's just the way it is. You're going to have these thoughts. They're going to be intrusive. Accept it. You have no control. So accept it. You're going to think differently from everybody else. Okay. That's you. You be you. And from there, then you would make all the goals that are actually going to match your life. Like, for instance, you're not going to have the goal to have, a wedding with, 300 people attending or something like that. You're not going to have a goal that you'll never be able to meet of, being an Instagram influencer or something like that. It's not going to happen. And accept it, and that's okay. And you can make different goals that match what you're capable of and your personality a lot better. You're just like, this is it. This is who I am. Now, that's the first part, is just, again, accept it. The second part is to never, ever lose track of the fact that the avoidant traits, those are not your organic, authentic self. That's not you. That was done to you. Those are coping techniques that you've developed to deal with the stress of some form of abuse. So they're not really you. My finger, sorry. They're permanent, they're there, but they're not like really you. If you go deeper underneath all that, you're not going to have avoidant traits in your personality at all. You're going to be different. And you probably wouldn't recognize yourself without the avoidant traits. You wouldn't be who you are. You wouldn't have made the choices you made. You wouldn't have the life you have. And people who've accepted the avoidant personality disorder, really, when push comes to shove, I don't think they would want to change their personality so radically to completely strip all that out. However, because they're not organic, they're not authentic, they're not the truth when it comes down to it, and you have an avoidant thought, it's really obvious because, I mean, it might feel very, very familiar, especially if you've been having them for years and years and years, but they also just logically don't make sense. So it's really obvious when you're having them. And when you do, then knowing that it's not authentic, you can fight it. Now, that doesn't mean it'll go away. Again, with the DBT, okay, and here's, because it's really hard when you're in it to try to explain, and it's really hard when you're in it to have somebody explain to you what exactly I'm talking about. So let me use borderline as the example. Borderline, once you're borderline, you can't change it. It's personality, well, assuming your personality said. You can't change it. So what you could do, though, through DBT, is you can learn to make the choice of how you're going to react to having your borderline thoughts. So, and this is why it works so well for them, is because when they have a borderline thought, which is that, you know, this person is going to abandon me, or, you know, I don't know who I am because this other person is acting some way that I didn't predict. I mean, that's truly how borderlines think. Then what they can do, what their normal reaction as an untreated borderline is to basically blow everything up. Just completely lose it. And rage and make accusations and do the crazy flip-flopping thing and I love you, I hate you. That is their automatic reaction to confusion and unease. DBT teaches them that they have the choice, that they can do that because that's their gut reaction, or they can quote-unquote act opposite the emotion and basically cool it and then wait until they've actually got full information and not destroy a relationship in the middle just because they're freaking out because they can't process their emotions because they're so crazy out of control because they have personality disorder, and it causes them to have this unnatural reaction just like avoidant people have an unnatural reaction. The avoidant reaction is not an external one, it's an internal one. It's my fault, it's all my fault, I'm a terrible person, I'm absolutely the worst about everything. And I mean, somebody asked me once, you know, how big is your ego that you think you're so special, that you think you cause all the terrible things in the world, and that you're somehow controlling everybody that gets near you? And I mean, that's a point. Logically, it makes no sense. You know, one of the big things in my therapy, Kat, what are you doing? Was literally going through lists of people, historical figures, people in the news, and people I knew and interacted with that were doing things worse than me. Because logically, it makes no sense. How can I be the worst if there's somebody else worse than me? And of course, my avoidance switched that all around and said, okay, well, these other people are acting so terrible and they're getting away with it. That's because their baseline is so much higher than me. That my baseline, I'm so intrinsically awful that it doesn't matter what I do, I'm still going to end up basically being worse than, you know, child molesters and murderers. And seriously, the avoidance made the illogical work. But you can fight that. And you can let it go. And actually, that's one of the things that was big, again, in DBT. It was really awful to be a person with avoidant personality disorder, to go through that. But there were things that were really good about it. And I bet if they stripped it down and changed it, that there could be a version that could be really helpful to somebody with avoidant personality disorder. But that was one of the things that you learn, is that a thought comes in and you acknowledge it, there's the thought, and then you let it go. And, you know, how many thoughts in a day do you have? You know, like, I've got 2 cats here trying to distract me, and I've acknowledged them both, and then I'm not, like, totally continuing to focus on the cats. I'm actually going back to whatever I was talking about previously and continuing my thought. People do that all the time, with, you know, all day long, with everything. If every single bit of information that came into your life, every, you know, color that you saw, every sound that you heard, every single thought, everything, I mean, you would be absolutely paralyzed if you had to take that information and focus on it effectively forever. Well, when you have something that aligns with the worst illogical thing of the avoidant personality disorder, you know, a thought that I'm terrible, that I caused this, that I'm to blame, I'm worthless, that this person deserves better than to be tortured by me, that my mere presence is torture. I mean, these types of thoughts that logically don't make sense, especially if you know somebody and it's somebody that cares about you. That's just bonkers. But it completely aligns with the avoidance. And so you've got this sort of paradox, and you can't let it go. You just sit there and focus on it, focus on it, focus on it. But you can. You can let those thoughts go, just like everything else. Like, you know, you've got a spot on your arm that itches, and then you scratch it for a second, and then you let the sensation go. You do the same thing with thoughts. That's one way to fight these things. The other way is to literally, you know, label it and say, this is an avoidant thought. Cat, knock it off. This is an avoidant thought. This is not a thought that I would have had. Yeah, I hear you. I'm not supposed to be against the door. Anyway, you know, to label it and just like, no, wrong. The other thing you can do that really is effective for me is to sort of, this is weird, but to delay acting on things. That, I don't know where that came from. I heard that idea both in finances, like they take your credit card and you put it and freeze it in a block in the freezer so that you have to wait a minute before you go shopping. Same with in weight loss, is you're like, okay, yeah, I can have that piece of cake, but I'm going to have it tomorrow, and just delay it. You can do the same thing with avoidant thoughts. You can say, okay, I'll come back to that thought. You can directly challenge it and say, this is an inaccurate thought. I'm not going to have this thought. This is wrong. Let me list all the ways that it's wrong. Now, that doesn't mean there will ever be a permanent fix. They're going to keep coming back. You're going to have these thoughts 50, 100 times a day. You won't even notice them. You have so many of them. They're just part of you. They're normal. That's one of the things that's really, that's one of the reasons why I think people should get a diagnosis. Is so that they can really learn about this part and this part and this part is avoidant, and it's not like everybody has, these are not general thoughts that every person on the planet has. These are specific to avoidant personality disorder. And also, and as I've said before, that you can then distinguish between diagnoses, because very, very common to have a comorbid diagnosis with avoidant personality disorder, and that it's not all one thing. It's not all jumbled together. So you might have a separate treatment that will work for part of your diagnosis, if it's this versus that versus the other. And, you know, no, you're never going to be 100% cured, but even 20%, if you can knock it back that much, you know, that's what makes it sort of livable. I hope that makes sense. You know, because that's like, in a way, that's a really depressing thought. Oh, it's never going to go away. You're going to have this forever. But, you know, some of it is so bad that it is absolutely, you know, it'll lay you low and eventually kill you. It will. That's why my very first video is on suicidal ideation. Because that's real. That's a coping technique that's been labeled maladaptive. I don't even think it's maladaptive. I think it's just straight up the coping technique that works. But anyway, I digress. You can always go look up that video if you want. But that's the plan, and it's pretty simple. Is accept the avoidance once you have a diagnosis. Don't do this if you just have traits, because traits, you really can find different coping techniques, and you can stop all your traits if you just have traits. If you don't have avoidant personality disorder at all, and you quote unquote accept it, and you don't change, so much of your life could be better if you don't have avoidant personality disorder. So don't do this if you don't have a diagnosis. You know for sure you have the personality disorder, and you're past your late 20s. Because even if you have avoidant personality disorder in your early 20s, I think they did start diagnosing in their teens. When I first got my first diagnosis, there was like age requirement. Again, because your personality shifts so much that they don't want to burden you with this idea that you have a personality disorder for your whole life, something that does not change. It's who you are, when actually there's times when it's not true. So don't pay the slightest bit of attention to anything I've said if you don't have a diagnosis. You don't know for absolute sure. You definitely have avoidant personality disorder. Not that you did a Google search and it sort of matches. Because, you know what? If you do a Google search for a recipe with flour, sugar, and milk, you're going to get a cake and a bread and, probably, 100 different other things. Who cares at the first one on the list? That doesn't necessarily mean that's what you got. So, and you could be missing something. So don't screw yourself over by self-diagnosing. But if you have a diagnosis, accept your diagnosis. It's also the biggest criticism I have of, I suppose, I don't know if you call it criticism, but like a frustration that I have with people with borderline is they almost never accept their diagnosis, at least in the beginning. They fight it. Don't fight the diagnosis. Accept your diagnosis, but then learn the difference. Find out what the avoidant thoughts are for you. And then when each comes, like I said, maybe it's like, whatever, who cares? Yeah, I'm terrible, whatever. And it doesn't really bother you. I mean, you get used to it. They don't bother you. They just don't. You ignore them. Or they're facts, or whatever. If it doesn't bother you. But if it is bothering you, if you're dwelling on it, if it's keeping you from doing something that you would like to do, and I know most avoidant thoughts will keep you from doing something, but there comes a point where really your life focus is something, and that's what you want, and not like, oh, I wish I had a partner, not that, but really truly like, this is something you just can't let it go. You need to have it, and the avoidant thoughts are keeping you from doing it. Well, you can fight those thoughts. You can do it. And that is the two-pronged approach that I have to living life with avoidant personality disorder. Or maybe it's three-pronged. Well, it's really two-pronged. It's one, accept it, and then two, when I have the avoidant thoughts, determined if it's something that is really getting in the way of my life, and if it is, then fight it, because that's possible. And it's probably like the most basic thing that you've ever heard in your life. Sorry. Sometimes the most basic things are the truest and the best and most effective. So I guess, yeah, that's about it.